So you want to talk about Passover, and I'm glad you do because um, I was just reading the book of Hebrews, which is in the New Testament, not the Old Testament. Uh, I don't
Hebrew
know
scriptures, yes.
that. And and so I'm fascinated by. I was doing a little from the book of Hebrews to Origin, the church father, to the book of Jubilees, which is your neck of the woods, um, about the identity of the destroyer in the Passover story. And so, yeah, I don't want to close until we get there.
All right, let me first of all say we need to get ready to be able to share the extraordinary power of Passover and Easter's promise. Uh, we're a week away from Passover, Saturday night, the 12th of April. It's a week before Holy Week. Saturday night is not a common time for us to start our Seder. Sunday morning, the 13th, is the first day of the festival, synagogue services. But Saturday night is when we fulfill the obligation of the ordered meal, a Seder. We read from the Haggadah, the telling of the story, and we recount what occurs in Exodus 12. I want to focus on 3 verses in Exodus 13, which everybody can find in whatever version of your Bible. And these 3 verses, 13, 6, 7, and 8, provide the cornerstone of what Jews have done since the singular, once only act of Pasach, Passover, in history. Think about this just for 1 minute. The origin of the Israelites, Judaism writ large, from which Christianity and later Islam come, is based on this moment in history.
Mhm.
Take a lamb, slaughter it, use its blood to mark the lintels, the doorposts of the house. So the 10th plague can occur. You want to parentheses, the destroyer is at the essence of that 10th plague. It occurs, all the firstborn throughout Egypt, in Pharaoh's house, even those held captive, even the firstborn animals are destroyed. Pharaoh finally says, leave. And before they actually leave, we get the following 3 laws. For 7 days, you shall eat unleavened cakes. Jews need to go out and buy matzahs. They're usually found in little boxes and will be in all supermarkets now. And other foods need to be eaten for 7 days because verse 7 says, and for 7 days, nothing with leavening, chametz, can be found inside your limits. So no grain, no fermentation, nothing that we would claim as normative. What we eat, what we don't eat, but it's verse 8 that for me is the building block of even this conversation. Higadta bincha. You must tell.
Mhm.
Actually, the translation, explain to your son, let's make it child, what happened there that God did for me. that I could be free. Do I think there was an event in history in which 600,000 men and others left? They talk about the Habiru, a people like the Hebrews. It's an origin story that transcends the necessity of historical fact. The Israelites were oppressed slaves. God hears them and says, I'm going to call you to serve me. Moses is chosen as the leader. 9 plagues attempt to prove to Pharaoh who's in charge. Pharaoh isn't interested, and we get to the 10th plague. Let's take a moment. The destroyer, Malach HaMavet.
So this is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So that's a complexity in how people read, I think, or imagine the Exodus narrative.
Yes. Look, I understand the necessity of the Gospels engaging in Jesus, the Judean, as the Paschal Lamb on the cross. I appreciate the Paschal atonement, the atonement sacrifice on Yom Kippur. What you're reading now is a rereading of Moses through an already developed Christian point of view.
So it's what Hebrews is doing throughout. It's a sermon throughout Hebrews is positioning Christ as the one whose death frees us from, among other things, the power of the devil. And so, yeah. So who is the active agent of the 10th plague, Rabbi Joseph? Is it the Lord or is it the destroyer with a capital D?
There is a active debate among the rabbis. The Haggadah says it's God. The Haggadah goes out of its way to make sure we understand God and God alone saved the Israelites, which meant God passed through Egypt and God saw the mark on the doors. Look, you had a wonderful byline in an email I got from you. A God who doesn't intervene gives us a functional atheism. We can discuss the problematic of verse 30 in Exodus 12. And every house had death in it. I struggle with a God who does that in order for me to be free, go to Sinai and serve God. If the intervention is on my behalf after 430 years of oppression, and I bear the burden of all firstborn, except for Pharaoh, dying, how do I handle that? And it's interesting, the rabbis are more sensitive even to what will come at the end of chapter 14 and 15 when Pharaoh's army dies in the Sea of Reeds and the heavenly hosts sing a hymn to God. And God rebukes the heavenly host. Don't sing while my children are drowning. In our seders, we take 10 drops of wine out of our cups before we read the 10 plagues as a symbolic way of acknowledging we can't have the full cup of joy at the expense of those who suffered. I think the text.
I mean, Miriam doesn't seem to be so troubled by that.
No, Miriam dances, which is one of the reasons later I think Miriam is given the title prophetess. I think it's a burden. I worry about Jews today. I suggest in my sermon I'll give tomorrow night, every Jew has to prepare for this Passover. Not only in what they buy, not only in what they take out of their cabinets. Some of us change our dishes. We have to reread the Haggadah in preparation for Higadta Bincha. Explain this to your child.
Mm-hmm.
How am I going to say 555 days into this war in Gaza, as I look at Gaza, this was done on my behalf?
Yeah.
Every house has death in it. And oh, by the way, I think that's true in Israel. I think our texts share, and we could go back and listen again to the sermon in Hebrews. There is an empathy needed to be in relationship to this God.
Mm-hmm.
I want the question, who was the destroyer, to be a question for which no easy answer is offerable. Do we move from Samael? There are, quote, malachim, created even in creation, that God uses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was so reading Hebrews, thinking about Holy Week, and then going back to Origen, and Origen's sermons on Leviticus. It was a good reminder that it's unwise and possibly dangerous to have concrete theories of the atonement if you're a Christian. There's just so much that Christians haven't read, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most Christians don't read Origen, and even Origen is far removed from the practice of Levitical sacrifice. And so just reading Origen helped me it's this whole process in Leviticus that constitutes the sacrifice. It's not the slaughter.
No.
And I think that for Christians that produces really bad readings of the gospel, where the crucifixion is isolated as a central event. Which, if you're going to talk about Jesus in terms of sacrifice, it has to be this whole sequence of events.
And look, Exodus 12, the specificity of this unique sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Go and get the lamb 2 days before you're going to slaughter it. Make sure it is of the following quality. If it's too big for your house, go gather others to share it with you. You must roast it. And then there are specifications. There's no other way to prepare it.
Hmm.
and it must be consumed that night. Can't leave anything behind. There's no other sacrifice with that amount of detail.
And I think, and I think in the Christian imagination, it's the slaughter that is um, central rather than the blood applied to the door that
Oh yeah.
spares.
Oh yeah.
It's just
I I think I may have said in an earlier conversation, I went to Tamil Nadu, the bottom of India, where there is a Hindu temple that still actively sacrifices goats. I was there for 5 hours,
hmm.
desperately trying to experience the value of sacrifice. It literally meant nothing to me. I don't get it. I don't know if it's my modernity, my philosophy. I don't know, but I have
All of the above.
yeah, I have no access to the spiritual act, taking a live animal, a knife, slaughtering it by cutting it through its throat, having the blood pour out all over everyone. No, I don't get it.
Well, I mean, surely, biblically speaking, part of that is because we both have many more possessions that are worth more than a goat to us. And so if we're going to give God a gift, uh, we've got deeper pockets than sheep and goats.
And the metal thin cards we carry in our wallet, they don't provide blood, as it were. Whatever this event was, and however the hyssop dipped in the bowl, what does it mean to put blood on your home so you won't be destroyed? Do you want people to know I'm not here as part of the 10th plague? And I always wondered how Moses felt about that. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's home.
Mm-hmm.
He knew the firstborn. He might well, as Hebrews said, he chose a different path. But did Moses care that the focus of the 10th plague, were those among whom he had once lived?
Yeah, and so Hebrews 11, I think one of the things that's interesting, I think, for Christians is it's not positing Moses as a type of Christ. It's positing Christ as a type of Moses.
Correct.
And so it's putting Jesus in line with Moses as the obedient leader of his people.
Who suffers?
Yeah. So I think it puts Moses in a far more positive light than I think Christian rhetoric often does.
Pharaoh survives the 10th plague. He's the firstborn. He survives, according to one rabbinic interpretation, even the Sea of Reeds collapsing in on everyone. And another rabbi says he has to survive these in order to be able to understand the impact of the lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Some say he became the king of Nineveh so Jonah could go and Pharaoh could see even a reluctant prophet can get a people to repent. Once again, learning a lesson he had refused to learn when it was his responsibility. Another rabbinic interpretation has the firstborn of Egypt going against their parents, coming into the palace demanding that Pharaoh let the Israelites go. Pharaoh has his army take the firstborn out and break their knees. When you see the obvious, What is it that denies you the ability to accept the obvious? Israel is not redeemed until the 10th plague. Pharaoh had said, destroy all the Israelite babies. He had gone to the women birthing the children, destroy them. They refused. Take the babies and throw them into the Nile. Sometimes the decisions we make come back to haunt us. Had Pharaoh, in fact, determined what the 10th plague was even before the plague started? I worry, just as a father and a grandfather, what will I explain to my family on Saturday night?
Mm-hmm.
How will I answer the question, what does this mean to me today? I have to take the burden of explaining it beyond the biblical text. And I don't know I know how to do that. And I will accept the burden of a Seder with questions that does not offer simple answers. Maybe that is the cornerstone of what the Seder was meant to be, even in the biblical text. This is the food you eat. This is the food you don't eat. But here now is the most difficult thing. Higadta bichincha. Explain this to your child. What does it mean to translate religion to the next generation? Those of us who are called to ministry, those of us who are called to interpret sacred texts, we're going to sustain this beyond just the job.
Robert Jensen has a line where he says that God is whoever raised Jesus Christ from the dead, having first raised Israel from slavery in Egypt.
Correct.
And so I think one of the answers to your question, I think, is what we teach, what Christians and Jews uniquely teach, is that God cannot be conceived of in the general categories of Greek religion, that God is identified in history, in these events,
and sustained in history.
Mm-hmm.
We can't use theology, liturgy. We have to go back and say, what does this mean today?
Mm-hmm.
And we look around and we see death in every home, not merely in Gaza. Are we waiting for the inexplicable to take away from us the burden of what this means? There's no destroyer on whom I can blame what's happening today. That would be easy. No, what we've accomplished for good and ill is on us. I think Jews need to be patient and watch our Christian brothers and sisters during Holy Week. What Good Friday means. We push away the pain of what Good Friday did in our interfaith relations, lift that up and put it aside. We watch Christians experience the suffering, because without that experience of suffering, the vigil and the hope for Sunday morning aren't possible.
Well, I was thinking about this so that, the New Testament uses the Hebrew scriptures to present a number of motifs to explain the manner of Jesus's death. Um, and the church has never settled on any one explanation.
Right.
But again, the book of Hebrews wants to map. It wants to map the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension according to the Levitical practice of sacrifice. And if that's true, then that means that Jesus' death is the sacrifice that sets us free into the wilderness. That should kind of temper some of our Easter triumphalism. That
I would hope.
Yeah, that we're not in the promised land. We're in the wilderness now.
We are freed. Both communities are freed for the purpose of service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
what we gain by telling this story again, by tasting the matzah, the bitter herbs, by retelling the event, is that there'll be a new set of questions. Maybe I will provoke someone by pointing to Gaza and asking, does this have any relationship to the 10th plague?
mm-hmm.
It's the conversation that is essential in getting us past the wilderness. There's that fabulous Numbers 13 and 14. The 12 spies are sent out. They don't realize they're 3 days from the border. 10 of them only see, it's more than we can bear. We look like grasshoppers in their eyes. Only Joshua and Caleb said, no, you can do this. That is the event in which God finally says, okay, you don't believe in your own destiny. And I always say, how shocking that the generation that goes through the Pasach, the night of Passover, the night of the destroyer, putting blood on their doors, leaving in haste, taking only what they could, crossing the sea. That generation still hasn't got enough to believe in their own destiny.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm reading and getting ready to tell this story again, knowing, wow, they're not going to make it. Another generation does make it. I think we both look at the Moses and Jesus leadership roles, and it's amazing they didn't walk away. Knowing that those who they were attempting to teach and lead
So talk a little bit, because you mentioned this in your sermon. You are a Jew in Brazil now. Talk about how that impacts the Passover menu.
The Sephardic community, the Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Mediterranean community, has a different interpretation of that which is forbidden. They eat rice. They eat some of the lentils, the grains that Ashkenazi Jews aren't permitted to have. Passover is the single most observed Jewish festival. and it is observed around family tables. The Haggadah is the single most adapted text in all Jewish liturgy. There are 5 more new Haggadahs this year. Telling this story requires eating. And some people are Eastern European and they're used to a particular kind of food that is based in their culture. Brazilian Jews, my family, the family into which I married, are from the Ukraine. But the Portuguese that dominated the culture here persecuted the Jews here with the Inquisition until the Dutch came for a few years and saved the Jews. Those Jews, new Jews, conversos, have absorbed the more indigenous cultures. And so Jews here don't follow all the Eastern European culinary assumptions. We do eat rice, we eat black beans, because it's a part of the way the Jewish culture has assimilated into the overall culture. We look for a piece of matzah called the afikomen. Afikomen is Greek for dessert. Why do I mention that? Because the Seder is not a part of biblical lore. The Seder is early rabbinic lore. The Last Supper was a prototypical Seder. It was a meal, not a full Seder, but questions were asked. The basic elements of unleavened cake, bitter herbs were eaten, wine was served. What does it mean to share a meal? And I mention that to you because Protestants call the table a time to share the meal.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're linked. That table, that meal is what I will do on Saturday night. It's a time of recreating community.
Yeah. It's interesting too that the way both tables play with time, right? So that for you, part of the Passover is to bring the past into the present,
Yep.
and for Christians, what Jesus does on Holy Thursday is distribute his body and blood in advance of him dying. So it's pulling the future into the present.
My hope is that at a time of division and distrust, Passover and Easter can be a moment where our communities once again stand in the presence of each other, acknowledging there's no way for either community to misunderstand how essential our scripture, our history, and our future. We have this word afikomen, which is Greek. We added it to the Seder to be reminded. We use every culture in which we've lived
Mm-hmm.
to repeat the development of this book. My prayers for the Christian community, for your church, for your family, is the hope connected with Easter Sunday. I hope you can join me in, we need greater strength and resilience in telling the story that has a burden as part of today. I want Israel and the Jewish people to survive, but I don't know how to explain that survival at the expense of death in every home.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of hope, maybe one day Christians and Jews can relax together at the Mar-a-Lago resort that Donald Trump will establish in Gaza.
I can only laugh rather than scream that, oh my God, how did we get here, Jason? The satire breaks on itself. I can't be frightened enough not to laugh, and I'm afraid of laughing.
Well, with your permission, I will post your sermon in addition to this recording.
Please, my permission, and we have to go back to our weekly lectionary. We owe each other the opportunity to share the risks of preaching the word.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of preaching, you could have made this sermon 3 times as long and gotten away with it in a Christian church.
It's very short because it will be translated from English into Portuguese. And so my friend who invited me said, half Edelheit.
Yeah, that's what Episcopalians tell me when I preach for them. So, well, Joseph, it's good to see you, and we'll have to do this again next week.
I hope so.
All right.